Good morning. I'm James Howard, and today I will be talking about election security and the policy concerns that go with it. Very quickly, I would like to talk about me, give some example of where I stand on this. I'm a data scientist at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. Um, in 2018, I was a candidate for state delegate here in Maryland, and here in 2020, I was candidate for convention delegate. I've also worked as an election judge here in Maryland back in 2004 for the primary in general. I've worked on numerous campaigns as a volunteer, more than I can count. Worked on helping to count the ballots in 1998 in Butler County, Ohio. I've kind of been doing this stuff pretty much my whole life. Yeah. One of the things I'd like to talk about first is elections in America. I find that a surprising number of people might need a little bit of a walkthrough of how the presidential election actually works. I think that in my experience, especially lately, I've heard a number of things that people said. People who are, in fact, very, very well educated and generally speaking, very intelligent, just did not understand how this works, possibly because of they didn't quite learn it right, or in one case, it was because they were explaining the version that was in the Constitution until 1804. I don't think they were alive in 1804. I just think they didn't realize that it wasn't quite laid out the same way. Things have changed. So the thing is about elections in America is that they're extremely decentralized. And this is true at every level. A contested election for governor or for senator or for anything is an extremely decentralized affair. And you see the most decentralized aspect of this when you go to vote at your polling place, because it's at those individual polling places and even within the polling booth that we see it at its most decentralized. We generally don't think of the individual polling booth as its own tabulation site, but frankly, it is, especially with electronic balloting. Now, with other systems where ballots are tabulated and counted or on paper and either tabulated on site, as they are here in Maryland, or in other places where they are tabulated at a central place, still these different levels of decentralization make sense. Now, for the purposes of the presidential election, we actually have 51 individual state elections. And we have 51 because for our purposes here, DC is a state. And each state generally devolves election authority to local counties. Local governments, that is. Counties and cities pretty much do the nuts and bolts of election operations. And then they share those results back with state authorities. And because of this, the state election authority's job is then to tabulate multi-jurisdictional results and manage reporting and compliance of election boards and election management at the local level. So I'm going to use Maryland here as the example because that's one I've been through most recently. So what happens here is that, for instance, if you are running, like I said, for a state office, even state delegate, which we only cover one county in Maryland, you have to go to the central state board to file. But then your ballots will be counted by that local county where you live, or two if your district spans two counties, and they're tabulated. But then all the results are sent down to the state for dissemination, and if they're across multiple jurisdictions, they get aggregated by the county or by the state. And this gets us to how presidential elections work in practice, because there are many moving parts here. Some of them are mandated by the Constitution, and some of them are mandated by law, and some of them just sort of happened, and we haven't really done anything with it. In many ways, it looks like the system was never really designed. So what we have are working forwards through the process. We have these primary elections, which is this ongoing festival of civic engagement that we see every 4 years. It seems to begin earlier and earlier each year, but the first ones start in January, of that year. And they go on until, I believe the last ones are now in July. And that system, as I said, has mostly an ad hoc collection of processes. One of the complicating features here is that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party do things very slightly differently, and it's worth understanding those differences. The primary for the Democratic Party, they allocate delegates to each state, and it is based on the proportion of votes each state gave to Democratic candidates for president in the last 3 elections. Then there are also some allocated to 5 U.S. territories, and then a group called Democrats Abroad, which represents expatriate members of the Democratic Party and wherever they live around the world. And then there's this also a group called superdelegates, who you might remember were a core part of the electoral process in 2016, for instance. And these are positions that are reserved for major Democratic office holders, such as governors, members of Congress, distinguished party leaders. There isn't a fixed number of them. Basically, there's a determination that, all Democratic governors hold one of these. And those delegates get elected. The superdelegates go and vote as they see fit. But the allocated delegates collect the votes for each candidate and represent each candidate in proportion to how many votes that candidate got in the state primary. It's actually a very nuanced and complicated process. So, for instance, when you go in most states to vote in the primary, you do not in fact vote for the candidate or the person you expect to be if you're in the Democratic Party primary. You actually vote for a collection of delegates for that candidate. The Republican Party does things a slightly bit differently here, and what they do is they allocate delegates for states based on there's a base amount for each state, and then there are more for each congressional district in the state, and then there's some additional allocations for territories and for the District of Columbia. The DC is not considered a state for that purpose. And then there are also a fixed number of superdelegates, which are reserved positions, and which are typically not even called superdelegates, which are reserved positions for state party representatives, and then a handful of others for governors and other state elected officials. It's important to understand that the primary process is a private election. These are effectively run by the state, but they're private. And as I just said, you don't actually vote for the candidate. You vote for the delegates who will then go to the convention and vote for your candidate. And then on top of the complication of all this, there are also different approaches that happen in different states. For instance, here in Maryland, we have the pure election where you vote for those delegates. And the same thing's true in New Hampshire, which is usually the earliest election in the primary season. But there's also some states have developed what they call caucuses, where people come together and spend the day debating, and then each area decides how their delegate shall vote. That is done in Iowa, and that happens first there. There's some other states that do that. Nevada comes to mind as one of them. So because of this complication, each state does things a little bit differently. And then the scheduling is also complicated because there is that broad, about 6-month period during which we have these caucuses and elections across the country. The scheduling is more or less ad hoc. It has developed over time, and there's absolutely no reason to just fix the way it is. It just is the way it is, and no one seems particularly interested in changing it. Then we go through to the general election day. And presumptively, you go through and vote. It's worth noting that I'm right now recording this on the day before Election Day here in 2020. So tomorrow will be a big day for, of course, anyone interested in this stuff. And at this point, you get different ballots in different places. Sometimes you end up with you end up voting for the named candidate. Some states actually will then put up the list of potential delegates, members of the Electoral College. We'll get to that in a second. See here, because in each state, the state tallies up all the votes, and whoever the absolute winner is of the state's votes, they get all of the electoral votes allocated to that candidate. And then there are two exceptions to that, because of course there are exceptions. One is Nebraska and one is Maine. Now, to understand how these are different, first we need to understand where the electoral votes come from. The electoral voting process is based on every state is allocated a number of electoral votes. Each one gets a base 2, which is designed to reflect the number of seats each state has in the Senate. And then each state gets one additional electoral vote for each member of Congress. So this kind of starts, it's mostly proportional, but there is that base 2 each state gets. And then DC is constitutionally gets the same number that they would get for each representative if they had one, but then also no more than the lowest number. So they end up getting 3 votes. So then what happens is, again, like I said, here in Maryland, all 10 of our votes will go to whoever wins the state that day on election day. Nebraska and Maine do this differently. 2 votes will go to the winner of the state. And then there's a winner for each congressional district, and then each one of those winners gets 1 vote for each congressional district they win. And this is why we've seen so many complicated election results, particularly recently. There have been several where we have had a few where the winner of the popular vote did not in fact win the election, because instead it's winning these key electoral votes is what counts. And this is why in some cases the loser may end up being the winner. Again, none of this is federally run. All of this is done by the states. And this is the part that's fairly transparent. What happens next is the Electoral College. And we talked about those electoral votes and where they come from. But what we need to make sure is that we understand how the Electoral College meets. It's not that all 538 come together. All 538 of these electors come together. What happens is each state, the electors will come together within their state and cast their votes. And there are a couple of rules on how this works. One is constitutionally it's mandated that they shall vote for president, and then they shall separately vote for the vice president. And at least one of the 2 may not be from that home state. So you cannot have Maryland electors, again, we'll pick on Maryland because I live there, voting for voting for a president and a vice president who are both domiciled in Maryland. They can vote for 2 that are domiciled in some other state, but this is why you make sure, this is one of the ways that there's a guarantee that you have these distinctions in areas in the system. These electors get selected, they go to cast their ballots. This usually happens about the middle of December, after the November election. You have a process. Electors are generally not actually do whatever they want once they get there. They don't have to vote for anyone in particular. And this is called what we call faithless electors, electors who vote for somebody other than who they were designated or selected to vote for. This happens fairly rarely. There are some states which actually impose fines on their electors if they do not cast the vote as they were instructed to based on the vote tally from November. But some states leave it wide open. And then all the Electoral College votes end up getting sent to Congress. And I want to talk a little bit here about what happens next. I don't have a slide for this, but then Congress gets the votes and then they count them. And this is a little bit beyond the spec of what I want to talk about here. But Congress counts these electoral votes, and provided some candidate gets a majority for president, that candidate then becomes the president on January 20th following the election. If not, then the House of Representatives gets to decide. And that's a whole other process, which is really kind of beyond the scope here, because I want to talk about the voting process. And this gets us to this idea of mail-in voting. Now, because it's 2020, and this is the coronavirus edition of Informs and the coronavirus edition of my talk, everything has been dominated this year, including the election process, by the issues surrounding coronavirus. It is basically unsafe to go to polls. It is basically unsafe to do a lot of things. So many states have adopted mail-in balloting at the last minute. Problem is, every state's already had mail-in balloting, and we call it absentee voting. Many states allow you to call up and request an absentee ballot with zero excuse. There are some states which require that you, explain, I'll be out of state that day, be traveling, I'm too sick to go out. Some states, Maryland for instance, many others now, basically require no excuse. You can get one just because you want to do it ahead of time. And then also many states have early voting, and we've seen early voting opening up in most states, even though it can be a little dicey with the coronavirus. And 5 states already do exclusive mail-in voting. The earliest to do this was Oregon, which started doing it in 2000 after a referendum was passed statewide mandating that all elections be conducted via mail. There are no polling places anymore in Oregon. And Hawaii was rolling that out this year, even before the coronavirus struck. So they were already in the middle of making that transition, and got a little bit of a kick to make sure it went really well this year. Other states, most specifically California, are slowly rolling it out. California is allowing each county to make that decision, but they're supposed to, when they make that transition, again, because it's run locally there, but they're slowly rolling it out. There is high participation found with, there has been an expectation along the way that we have higher voter participation, and that has found, but it also may not seem to stick. It seems that it drops back off to mail-in balloting levels after. There have also been, almost no cases of voter fraud conducted via mail or basically via any other mechanism. You can count on one hand the number of instances you get in any given year of any voter fraud, and most of those turn out to be more confusion than anything. And so what this means is that we have, as I've said, this electoral system is extremely decentralized. No local area oversees more than a population of about 10 million people. In fact, the largest voting jurisdiction, where there's one canvassing organization, local board of elections, that oversees this, is Los Angeles County with 4.3 million voters. Many counties have an average of about 50,000. The mean is about 50,000 voters per county, leaving you with a mean county population of about 100,000. But, so we have 3,400 or so county and county-like jurisdictions in the United States, each one of these overseeing these elections. So this is exceptionally decentralized. And state rules differ from state to state in how ballots are, what they're issued, how they can be pulled back, when they can be cast, how early voting works, and like I was saying, rules for absentee voting. And then counties have a lot of freedom in implementing these rules. For instance, some states will mandate how, what electoral machine is used, whether it's all jurisdictions in the state will use the same, say, optical voting system, or they mandate that an optical voting system must be used, and each county's on to its own to decide which one it wants to purchase. Which means that there are many different standards and transfer mechanisms across the country. And that leads to a strong diversification of methods and mechanisms. You have systems ranging still from pulling a lever, leading to, you might recall, the hanging chads in 2000, through to optical systems, to pure electronic voting, to other sorts of scanning systems. Why this matters is not so much about this talk, but about the other talks that are happening here. We're having talks here about other aspects of election security, whether that's training people better or building slightly better systems. What I'm going to point out here is that this decentralization is what matters the most. And this matters because it leads to security in and of itself. This kind of hits back on some of the basic ideas we've seen in other areas of security, for instance, the internet. And that is, when you have greater diversification, it requires more work and more effort to take it on. And that is very important for protecting the electoral system as well. You cannot develop, for instance, a single way to hack into the voting system when there are potentially 3,400 voting systems, and in practice, at least several dozen. You also have more ability to catch different attempts because you will have different safeguards built into each system that allow you to see different things in different ways. So in a sense, it's not that the system is unhackable. I'm not going to say that. But what I will say is it becomes substantially more difficult. And that's what I'm here to say. Hacking the election is hard. The systems and processes we have in place make it very difficult to build a sustained attack, a broad-based attack against the system. And building stronger systems is, of course, important. And building better training mechanisms is important. And all of this together is very important. But remember right off the bat what system this is going into. When we train our election judges better, for instance, this is a system they're moving into, and one that already has a number of accidentally built-in safeguards. And building better safeguards is always better. But we need to know what framework they're moving into. So thank you, everyone.